The photo came through on a Tuesday afternoon, an ordinary Tuesday, the kind where I was folding laundry and thinking about what to make for dinner. My sister's name flashed on the screen, a photo sent by mistake, meant for someone else entirely. I opened it without thinking. And in that single second, standing barefoot on my own kitchen floor, 8 years of my marriage turned into a lie I hadn't known I was living. My husband was holding 2 newborn babies. The caption underneath read, "Daddy loves you both." I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I just stood there, phone in hand, and felt something inside me go completely permanently still. My name is Nicole Young. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I believed patience was a virtue that eventually got rewarded. I'm a forensic accountant by trade, which means I spend my days finding the small inconsistencies that people think no one will notice, a number that doesn't add up, a transaction that doesn't belong, a story that almost makes sense but doesn't quite. I built a career on trusting evidence over emotion. I just never thought I'd need those skills at home. Charles and I got married when I was 30. He was ambitious, funny, the kind of man who filled a room without trying. He co-owned a logistics company that was just starting to take off, and I loved watching him build something from nothing. We used to talk about the family we'd have, how many kids, what we'd name them, whether we'd raise them in the city or move somewhere quieter. It felt inevitable. It felt like something that was simply going to happen to us the way summer follows spring. It didn't happen, not easily and not for a long time. We tried for 2 years before we even sought help. Then came the appointments, the tests, the terminology that started to feel like a second language. IUIIVF, hormone injections that left bruises on my stomach. I hid under looser shirts. We lost 3 pregnancies before they ever became anything more than a heartbeat on a screen. Each one, a private grief I carried mostly alone because Charles always seemed to recover faster than I did. I used to lie awake at night doing the math in my head. The way I did with client files. Where did this go wrong? What did I miss? What could I have done differently? I blamed my body. I blamed stress, my job, the wine I'd had one night before I knew I was pregnant the first time. I blamed everything except the truth, because the truth wasn't something I had access to yet. Through all of it, Charles held my hand in waiting rooms and told me the same thing over and over, like a promise he needed to keep saying out loud to make it real. "We'll get through this together." I believed him. I believed him the way you believe the sun will rise, without evidence, without question, simply because the alternative was unthinkable. My sister Emily was there too, or at least she seemed to be. 3 years younger than me, always warm, always available, with a hug or a casserole or a "call me anytime" that I took at face value. She used to tell me she admired my strength. She used to say she didn't know how I did it. I never once considered that admiration and envy can wear the exact same face. The day the photo came through, I had just gotten off a video call with a client, the kind of dull afternoon that makes up most of a life. I remember the light coming through the kitchen window at a low angle, the way it does in late fall. I remember the phone buzzing twice. And then I remember looking down and seeing my husband's face, the same face that had told me only 3 weeks earlier that we should maybe try one more round of treatment, that we shouldn't give up yet, looking down at 2 infants like they were the center of his entire world. Emily called almost immediately after. I picked up without saying anything. "Nicole," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean for you to find out like this." I hung up. I didn't ask a single question. I didn't need to. 8 years of forensic training had taught me one thing above all else: once you find the first inconsistency, you don't confront the person who created it. You gather everything first. You confirm the full shape of the lie before you ever let them know you've seen it. So I opened my laptop instead. I found a family law attorney with the highest rating in the city, someone named Daniel Brooks, and I booked the earliest appointment available. 2 days later, I sat across from him in an office that smelled like fresh coffee and expensive paper, and I signed the initial paperwork to begin divorce proceedings against my husband of 8 years. My hand didn't shake. I remember being almost surprised by that. I didn't tell Charles. I didn't tell Emily. I knew. I went home that night and made dinner like nothing had happened, because for the first time in years, I understood something with total clarity. I wasn't the one who needed to explain myself. While my husband celebrated the arrival of 2 children with the woman who had once called herself my sister, believing I still knew nothing at all, I was already 3 steps ahead of both of them. And what I did next, quietly without a single tear, was something neither of them would see coming. The morning after I signed the paperwork, I woke up before sunrise and did something I hadn't done in months. I made coffee for 1 person instead of 2, and I didn't feel a single ounce of guilt about it. Charles had texted the night before some casual message about a work trip that would keep him out of town for a few days. I read it twice. Then I got to work. If there's one thing my career taught me, it's that people who are confident they'll never get caught leave the messiest trails. They stop being careful because they've convinced themselves they don't need to be. Charles had spent 8 years building a reputation as a devoted husband, struggling through infertility right alongside me. That story required maintenance, and people who are busy maintaining one story rarely notice they're leaving evidence of another. I started with the credit card statements. We'd always kept mostly separate accounts, a decision that had felt practical at the time and now felt almost prophetic. But there was a joint account we used for house expenses, and buried in months of grocery runs and utility payments, I found 4 separate charges to the same hotel in a suburb neither of us had any reason to visit. 2 nights each time. Always a Thursday into a Friday. I cross-referenced the dates against my own calendar, the one on my phone that logs everything automatically, including location history. I'd honestly forgotten I had turned on. 3 of those hotel dates lined up exactly with weeks I was recovering from IVF procedures, weeks Charles had told me he needed to clear his head by staying late at the office. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open until nearly 2 in the morning, and piece by piece the last 3 years of my marriage rearranged themselves into something I barely recognized. Emily had told me more than once that she was simply the one driving Charles to his appointments when I couldn't make it a doctor's visit here, a follow-up there. "I'm just helping out," she used to say, like it cost her nothing. I found records showing those appointments often happened on days Charles had no medical visits scheduled at all. By the time I found the joint photo storage account, Charles didn't know I still had access to a shared cloud folder from years earlier that had never been deactivated. I wasn't even surprised anymore. There were photos going back nearly 3 years. Emily at his office holiday party standing just a little too close. A weekend getaway logged under a business trip with a beach visible in the background that was nowhere near any client site. They hadn't been careless exactly. They'd simply never imagined I would look. I want to be honest about something. There's a particular kind of pain that comes from confirming a betrayal you already suspected, and it is different from the shock of discovering one you never saw coming. This was the second kind. And underneath the pain, something colder was taking shape. Clarity. For 8 years I had absorbed every hard moment of our marriage as my own failure. My body, my fault, my burden to fix. Now I understood I had been carrying the weight of someone else's choices the entire time. I didn't confront Charles. I didn't call Emily back. Instead I did what I do best. I built a file. Every hotel charge, every mismatched alibi, every photo with a timestamp that told a truer story than either of them had ever told me out loud. I organized it the way I would organize evidence for a client, methodically, without commentary, because the facts didn't need my anger attached to them. They spoke clearly enough on their own. I sent the entire file to Daniel Brooks 2 days later. He read through it in front of me during our second meeting, his expression unreadable in the practiced way of someone who has seen every version of heartbreak a marriage can produce. When he finally looked up, he simply said, "This is thorough." I told him I'd had 8 years of practice noticing what other people missed. He didn't ask what I meant by that, and I didn't explain. It was 3 days after that meeting when my phone rang with a number I recognized, but hadn't expected Margaret Charles's mother. We'd always had a warm relationship, the kind built on genuine affection, rather than obligation. She used to call just to check in, to ask about work, to tell me about her garden. This call felt different from the moment I answered. Her voice was thin, unsteady, in a way I'd never heard from her before. "Nicole," she said, and then nothing for a long moment, just breathing on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, she was crying, trying and failing to keep her voice even. "Please," she said, "don't tell him yet." I stood very still in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd seen that photo just over a week earlier, and felt the ground shift again beneath something I thought I already understood completely. "Don't tell him what, Margaret?" I asked. She didn't answer the question. She just kept repeating those 4 words over and over like they were the only thing holding her together. "Don't tell him yet. Don't tell him yet." I realized, standing there, listening to my mother-in-law fall apart on the phone, that I had uncovered an affair. But somehow, impossibly, I had the growing sense that I had not yet uncovered the truth. I met Margaret 2 days later at a small coffee shop halfway between our houses, a place we'd been to a dozen times before over the years, always for easy, comfortable conversations. This time she was already seated when I arrived, hands wrapped so tightly around her cup that her knuckles had gone pale, and she didn't look up until I pulled out the chair across from her. She looked older than I remembered. Not in years, but in something heavier, the kind of tired that comes from carrying a weight for far too long without setting it down. Margaret had always been composed, the sort of woman who ironed her napkins and never raised her voice even during arguments. The woman sitting across from me now looked like she hadn't slept in days. "I need you to understand something," she said before I'd even taken off my coat. "What I'm about to tell you I should have said 8 years ago. I've regretted staying silent every single day since." I didn't say anything. I'd learned in my line of work that silence is often the fastest way to get someone to keep talking. Margaret took a slow breath and told me that she had known something important, something that would have changed everything since almost the very beginning of our marriage. She said it in pieces, circling the actual information the way people do when they're afraid that saying it plainly will make it permanently real. "Does Emily know?" I asked, because that was the question sitting heaviest on my chest. If my own sister had known some secret about my marriage for years and said nothing while sleeping with my husband, I wasn't sure I'd survive the answer. Margaret shook her head firmly. "No, Emily doesn't know any of this. Neither does Charles." Her eyes met mine, and there was something almost pleading in them. "Only me, and one other person." "Who?" "Dr. Collins, your old doctor." I felt my stomach tighten. Dr. Rebecca Collins had overseen nearly every stage of our fertility treatment 8 years earlier. The tests, the procedures, the countless conversations about odds and options, and what might come next. I hadn't spoken to her in years, not since we'd finally stopped treatment, and tried to make peace with the life we had instead of the one we'd planned. "What does she have to do with this?" I asked. Margaret's hands trembled around her cup. "There was a report. Results from testing back when you two were still trying everything you could. I saw it before Charles did. I wasn't supposed to. It came to the house by mistake, addressed to him, and I opened it without thinking, the way you do with mail that looks routine." She paused, and when she continued, her voice had dropped almost to a whisper. "It wasn't routine." I sat perfectly still, waiting. I read it, and I understood immediately that if Charles saw it, it would break something in him that I didn't think could be repaired. So I made a decision. I called Dr. Collins directly and asked her as a mother to let me handle it in my own way, in my own time. She agreed against her better judgment because she'd known our family for years, and she trusted me to do right by everyone. Margaret looked down at the table. "I never did right by anyone. I just delayed the pain and let it grow into something much bigger." I thought about all the pieces I'd already gathered, the hotel receipts, the mismatched alibis, the photographs that told a truer story than either Charles or Emily ever had. I had assumed walking into this conversation that I understood the full shape of my own marriage's collapse. Sitting across from Margaret, I realized I'd only been looking at the surface of something much older and much stranger. "Margaret," I said carefully, "what did that report say?" She reached into her purse with shaking hands and pulled out a small worn slip of paper. Not the report itself, she explained, but a note she'd written to herself the day she read it, something to help her remember exactly what it said, in case she ever found the courage to bring it forward. She didn't hand it to me. She just held it like it was something too dangerous to release into the world just yet. "I can't tell you here," she said. Not like this, not in pieces. You deserve to see it properly the way I should have shown Charles 8 years ago, instead of hiding it in a drawer and telling myself I was protecting him." Her voice caught. I was protecting myself. From watching him fall apart. From being the one who broke him. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine, an instinct I couldn't quite explain given everything I now knew she'd kept from us. Whatever she was carrying, it had clearly cost her nearly a decade of peace. "I need to see that file," I told her. "The real one, wherever Dr. Collins keeps her records." Margaret nodded, slowly wiping her eyes with the back of her free hand. Then she said something that stayed with me for the rest of that day, replaying itself over and over, as I drove home through streets that suddenly felt unfamiliar. "Those babies changed everything, Nicole," she said quietly. "But not for the reason Charles thinks." I called Dr. Rebecca Collins's office the next morning before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. I hadn't spoken to her in nearly 5 years, not since the last failed round of treatment, when Charles and I had quietly agreed to stop trying and let ourselves grieve the family we weren't going to have. Her receptionist put me through faster than I expected, and when Dr. Collins picked up, her voice carried a note of surprise that quickly shifted into something more careful. "Nicole," she said, "it's been a long time. I need to see my old file," I told her. "All of it, every test, every result from the year we were doing treatment together." There was a pause on the line long enough that I could hear the low hum of the clinic in the background. "Can I ask what's brought this on?" "Margaret came to see me," I said simply. Another pause, shorter this time. "Come in this afternoon," she said. "I'll pull everything myself." The clinic looked almost exactly as I remembered it. The same soft gray walls, the same watercolor prints meant to make devastating news feel gentler than it was. Dr. Collins met me in her office rather than an exam room, a thick folder already waiting on her desk. She was in her 50s now, silver threading through hair that had been mostly dark the last time I'd sat across from her, but her manner was the same measured kind, unwilling to soften facts into something more comfortable than they were. "Before I show you this," she said, "I want you to know I've regretted my part in this for years. Margaret came to me in a moment of real distress, and I made a choice I wouldn't make again. I let a mother's fear override a patient's right to their own results." She slid the folder toward me. "I'm sorry, Nicole. Truly." I opened it with hands that were steadier than I expected, given what I already suspected I might find. Inside were pages I recognized, hormone panels, ultrasound notes, the familiar shorthand of 8 years of trying. But near the back there was a report I had never seen before, dated almost exactly 8 years earlier, addressed to Charles, specifically never to me. I read through the medical language, slowly translating it in my head, the way I'd once translated financial statements for confused clients, until the meaning became unmistakable. The results weren't about me at all. They were about Charles. The report showed clearly and clinically that the difficulty we'd faced for years hadn't originated with my body the way I had spent nearly a decade believing. There was a male factor finding significant enough that Dr. Collins had recommended in writing that we discuss alternative paths forward together as a couple. That letter had gone home in an envelope addressed to Charles. Margaret had opened it by mistake, and instead of handing it to her son, she had made a decision alone, in a moment of panic to protect him from a truth she thought he couldn't survive. I sat there in that quiet office and felt 8 years of self-blame rearrange itself into something entirely different. Every late night I'd spent doing mental math on what I might have done wrong. Every procedure I'd endured believing my own body was the reason we were suffering. Every apology I'd whispered to Charles in the dark, sorry I couldn't give him what he wanted. None of it had ever belonged to me in the first place. Why didn't she ever tell him? I asked, though some part of me already understood the shape of the answer. "Fear, I think," Dr. Collins said gently. Margaret loved her son fiercely, in the way some mothers do, where protecting him mattered more than the truth. She convinced herself that if he never knew, it would never have to hurt him. I don't think she considered what it would eventually cost you both. I thought about Emily then, about a photograph of Charles holding two newborns, a caption calling him Daddy, without hesitation, without question. If the report in front of me was accurate, and I had no reason left to doubt it, then those children weren't biologically his, which meant Emily either didn't know the truth herself or she knew something even more complicated than an affair. I didn't say any of this out loud. I simply asked Dr. Collins for copies of everything, and she made them for me without hesitation, sliding the fresh pages across her desk, like she was finally, after 8 years, allowed to do her job the way she should have from the start. I didn't confront Charles that day. I didn't call Emily. I didn't even call Margaret right away, though I knew I owed her some kind of response after everything she'd finally told me. Instead, I drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for a long time, the folder resting on the passenger seat beside me, and I thought about every version of my marriage I had believed in over the years. The hopeful version, the grieving version, the betrayed version I'd been living in for the past 2 weeks. None of them had been the complete truth. And now I was holding the piece that changed the meaning of everything else. When I finally called Margaret that evening, my voice was calm, in a way that seemed to surprise her. "I have the file," I told her. "I know what it says." She was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and when she finally spoke, there was something like relief threaded through her exhaustion, as if a burden she'd carried alone for 8 years had finally partially been set back down. "Now I know why your mother looked terrified," I said the moment she saw those babies for the first time. I didn't hear from Charles for almost 2 weeks after I filed the paperwork. He was staying with Emily wherever that was, playing house with 2 infants that carried a truth he didn't yet understand. I spent those 2 weeks quietly finishing what I'd started, meeting with Daniel Brooks twice more, organizing financial records, moving through the practical motions of ending a marriage while carrying a secret that would eventually end it, for reasons far different than the ones I'd originally believed. I didn't reach out to Emily. I didn't know yet what she understood about any of this, and honestly I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Some betrayals are simple enough to survive through sheer anger. This one had roots I was still trying to fully understand myself. It was Margaret who called me on a Thursday evening, her voice tight with something between dread and urgency. "Charles is coming home," she said. "Tonight. He wants me to meet the babies properly." A pause. "He's bringing Emily." I understood immediately what she meant and what it would take from her. "Margaret, you don't have to do anything you're not ready for." "I've hidden this for 8 years, Nicole," she said quietly. "I think it's time I stopped." I wasn't there when it happened, but Margaret told me everything afterward in enough detail that I could see it clearly in my mind, almost as if I'd been standing in the doorway myself. Charles arrived first, letting himself in with the same easy confidence he carried into every room he'd ever entered, the confidence of a man who has never once questioned whether he deserved good things. Emily followed behind him, a baby carrier in each hand, her face carefully arranged into something between apology and pride. Margaret told me later that Emily looked exhausted in the particular way new mothers do, but also lit up from somewhere underneath the exhaustion, the way people look when they believe they've finally gotten something they'd wanted for a long time. Charles set his bag down by the door and turned toward his mother with an expression Margaret said she would never forget. Open, hopeful, almost boyish, the look of a man about to hand his mother the best news of his life. "Mom," he said, gesturing toward the twins Emily was carefully lifting from their carriers. "You're finally a grandmother." Margaret told me the room went very quiet after that. She said she looked down at those 2 small faces, and something inside her simply gave out. All the years of holding this in, all the sleepless nights, convincing herself she was protecting her son by staying silent, collapsed in on themselves the instant she saw those babies in her son's arms. She said she felt the blood leave her face, felt her legs go unsteady beneath her, and she had to reach for the back of a chair just to stay upright. Charles noticed immediately, his smile faltering into confusion. "Mom, what's wrong?" She told me she opened her mouth, and the words that came out weren't the ones she'd rehearsed 1,000 times over 8 long years. They came out smaller, more broken than she intended, but they were finally after everything true. "Wait," she whispered. "She didn't tell you." Charles went still. Emily, standing just behind him with one baby still in her arms, went pale in a way Margaret said she noticed immediately, a reaction that told her something important Emily didn't know either. Whatever Margaret was about to reveal, it was news to both of them in different ways for different reasons. "Tell me what," Charles asked, his voice dropping into something careful, something that already sensed the ground shifting beneath him. Margaret didn't answer right away. She told me she stood there for a long moment, looking between her son and the woman he'd built a secret family with, and she felt the full weight of 8 years pressing down on that single, unbearable silence. She said she thought about me, about the years I'd spent blaming my own body, apologizing for something that had never been my failure to begin with. She said that thought was what finally gave her the courage to move. According to Margaret, nobody spoke for what felt like an impossibly long stretch of time. Emily shifted the baby in her arms, her expression tightening with a fear that had nothing to do with judgment and everything to do with confusion. Charles stood frozen by the door, still in his coat, waiting for an answer his mother wasn't ready to give him, standing in a hallway. Margaret told me she finally walked into the study without another word, and knelt down in front of the small fireproof safe she'd kept in the back of the closet for exactly this moment, the one she'd told herself for 8 years. She would open when she was ready, though some part of her had begun to wonder if that day would ever actually come. Her hands were shaking, she said, as she worked the combination. Charles had followed her partway down the hall, standing in the doorway of the study, now watching his mother kneel on the floor in front of a safe he hadn't known existed. Emily stood further back, still holding one of the twins, her face a mixture of confusion and something that looked, Margaret said, almost like fear. Inside the safe was a single sealed envelope, worn soft at the edges, from 8 years of being touched, considered, and returned to its hiding place. Margaret lifted it out with both hands, the way you'd carry something fragile, something that had already broken once, and might break again the moment it was finally opened. She turned back toward her son, envelope held against her chest, and for the first time in 8 years, she was finally ready to let him see everything it contained. Margaret carried the envelope back into the living room and set it down on the coffee table between them, her hand still trembling slightly as she withdrew her fingers from it, as if letting go of something she'd protected for so long required its own kind of effort. Charles stood over it for a moment without touching it, and Margaret told me later that she could see him bracing himself the way people do right before they step into cold water. "What is this?" he asked quietly. "Sit down," Margaret said. "Please." He sat. Emily lowered herself onto the edge of the armchair across from him, still holding one of the twins against her shoulder, the baby fussing softly in the tense silence of the room. Margaret opened the envelope herself, her fingers moving carefully over paper that had clearly been folded and unfolded many times over the years, and laid the contents out on the table. 1 page at a time, the original lab results, a letter from Dr. Collins addressed directly to Charles, and a handwritten note Margaret had added years earlier, dated the same week she'd intercepted the original mail. Charles picked up the medical report first. Margaret watched his eyes move across the page, slowly at first, then faster, then slower again, as he reread certain lines, trying to make sense of language that wasn't especially complicated, but was clearly rearranging something fundamental in his understanding of the last 8 years of his life. "This says," he started, then stopped. He looked up at his mother. "This is about me." "Yes," Margaret said softly. "This isn't Nicole's file. This is mine." His voice had gone strange flat in a way Margaret said she'd never heard from him before. "You're telling me the reason we couldn't have kids was never her?" Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Charles set the paper down with exaggerated care, like his hands had suddenly become unreliable. 8 years, he said. 8 years I let her think it was her fault. She apologized to me, Mom. She used to cry and apologize to me, and I let her. His voice cracked on the last word. Because I never knew there was anything to say otherwise. Emily had gone very still across the room, the baby now quiet against her shoulder. Margaret told me she watched something shift across Emily's face as the pieces started arranging themselves if the report was accurate. If the male factor diagnosis 8 years earlier had been real and unresolved, then these children in her arms conceived with Charles during their affair weren't likely to share his biology either. The same condition that had made conception nearly impossible with me would have made it just as unlikely with her. Charles. Emily said carefully, "What does this mean?" He didn't answer her. He was still looking at his mother, something raw and furious building behind his eyes. "You knew," he said. "You've known for 8 years and you let me believe—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He stood up abruptly, paper still in his hand, and started pacing the length of the living room like he needed his body to move, because his mind had stopped being able to hold still. "I was trying to protect you," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "I know that's not an excuse. I know what it cost you both. I've hated myself every single day since." "Protect me from what?" Charles's voice rose for the first time. "From the truth. From a piece of paper. You let me watch my wife blame herself for 8 years, Mom. You let me watch her go through procedures, through losses, through everything, thinking it was her body failing us when the whole time—" He stopped pressing the heel of his hand against his forehead, like he was trying to physically hold his thoughts together. Emily stood slowly shifting the baby onto her hip. "Charles," she said, again quieter this time, "I need you to look at this with me. If what this says is true, then these babies—" She couldn't finish either. The room fell into a silence heavier than anything that had come before it. Margaret told me that Charles finally turned toward Emily then, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with the sudden cold understanding that whatever they had built together over the past 3 years had been built on the exact same broken foundation as the marriage he'd just destroyed. The affair. The secrecy. The children he'd been so proud to introduce as his own less than 10 minutes earlier. None of it meant what he'd believed it meant. Walking through that door, he looked at the reports scattered across the coffee table, then at his mother, then at Emily holding a child that might not carry his blood at all. Margaret said his face went through something she could only describe as a kind of collapse. Not physical, but internal, like watching a building come down from the inside, while the outer walls somehow remained standing. "I need to see Nicole," he said finally, his voice hollow. "I need to talk to her. Charles." Margaret started, "Maybe you should sit with this first. Give yourself some—" But he was already moving, grabbing his keys off the entry table, pulling the front door open before anyone could stop him. Margaret said she called after him once, his name catching in her throat, but he didn't turn around. She stood in the doorway and watched his car pull out of the driveway too fast, taillights disappearing down the street into the dark. What Charles didn't know yet, driving toward my house with 8 years of buried truth cracking open behind him, was that some doors, once they've closed all the way, don't open again, just because someone finally understands why they should have stayed shut. Charles showed up at my house a little after 9 that night. I watched his headlights sweep across the living room wall before I even heard the car door, and I knew with a strange kind of calm exactly what this visit was about. I didn't rush to the door. I finished folding the towel I was holding, set it down on the counter, and walked over at my own pace. He looked different standing on my porch than he had in 8 years of marriage, undone in a way I'd never seen from him, his collar askew, his eyes red-rimmed like a man who'd been crying in his car for the length of the drive over. He was still holding the medical report, creased now from being gripped too tightly. "You knew," he said before I'd even opened the door fully. "Nicole, you knew, didn't you, about the report about—" He held it up like evidence, like he needed me to confirm something he already understood was true. "I found out 2 weeks ago," I said. "The same way I found out about Emily, by accident." He flinched at her name. "Nicole, I swear to you I had no idea any of this." "I know," I said, and I meant it. That was the strange part. Standing there on my own porch, looking at the wreckage of a man who had just learned that 8 years of guilt he'd let me carry alone had never belonged to me, I felt something closer to sorrow for him than anger. Not enough sorrow to change what I'd already decided. just enough to remember that he too had been living inside a lie someone else constructed, even if he'd built plenty of his own lies on top of it. "Can I come in?" he asked. "Please, I just need to talk." I let him in, though, not because I owed him anything. I let him in because I wanted this conversation to happen on my terms in my space where I could end it whenever I chose to. We sat in the living room where we'd spent 8 years of holidays and quiet evenings, and he told me everything: how his mother had shown him the file, how Emily had gone pale, realizing the twins likely weren't biologically his, either how the affair he'd built with such careful confidence had crumbled apart in the space of 10 minutes. He talked fast, almost desperate, like if he explained enough fast enough I might reconsider everything sitting in Daniel Brooks' office. "I'm not asking you to forgive Emily," he said. "I'm not even asking you to forgive me for the affair. I know that's inexcusable. But Nicole, if I'd known if my mother had just told me the truth 8 years ago, none of this would have happened. You have to see that this started with a lie that wasn't mine." I let him finish. I'd learned across 8 years of marriage and a career built on separating fact from noise that people almost always reveal more when you let them talk themselves all the way to the end. "You're right," I said finally. "The lie wasn't yours. Your mother made a choice she shouldn't have made, and she's going to carry that for the rest of her life, and honestly, Charles, I think she already understands that better than either of us could tell her." I paused. "But you're wrong about one thing. This didn't start with your mother's secret. It started the day you decided that whatever you were missing at home, you were entitled to go find somewhere else with my sister, without ever once telling me you were struggling." "I didn't know how to say it," he said quietly. "You were already carrying so much." "So you let me carry more," I said. "You let me believe I was the reason we couldn't have a family for 8 years while you built one with someone else. The medical report doesn't undo that, Charles. It explains part of the pain. It doesn't erase the choice you made in response to it." He didn't have an answer for that. I watched something in his face finally accept what I was saying. The fight going out of him, the way it does when someone realizes the argument they've been building in the car, the whole drive over, doesn't actually hold up once it's spoken out loud. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. "Now," I said, "the divorce moves forward. Nothing about tonight changes that." He nodded slowly, staring down at his hands at the report still creased between his fingers. "And Emily, that's not my concern anymore," I said, and I found saying it out loud that it was true. Somewhere in the past 2 weeks, between the hotel receipts and Margaret's confession and the quiet clinical language of an old medical file, I had stopped needing to know what happened to my sister. Whatever she and Charles had built together, they would have to figure out what remained of it without me as an audience. Charles left a little before midnight. I stood at the window and watched his taillights disappear down the same street they'd come from, and I felt for the first time in 2 weeks something settle inside my chest instead of tighten. For 8 years I had measured my worth against a story that was never true. I understood now that the ending of my marriage had never really been about a photograph or a betrayal, or even a secret buried in a medical file. It had been about the moment I finally stopped waiting for someone else to tell me the truth and went and found it myself. The final mediation was scheduled for a Thursday morning 3 weeks after Charles had sat in my living room, reading a report that changed the meaning of everything he thought he understood about our marriage. I remember dressing for it the way I'd dress for any important meeting, simple, composed, nothing that suggested I'd spent a single extra thought on how I wanted to appear. I wasn't performing strength anymore. By that point, I simply had it. Daniel Brooks met me outside the courthouse a few minutes early, running through the final details one last time, though there wasn't much left to discuss. The financial disclosures were thorough. The settlement terms were fair if not generous toward Charles, given everything the paper trail had revealed. I'd asked for nothing more than what I was entitled to. I didn't need to punish him through the numbers. The truth had already done more damage than any settlement could. Charles was waiting inside with his own attorney, looking smaller somehow than the man I'd married, though I understood that had less to do with the room and more to do with the 3 weeks he'd just lived through. His mother's secret had cost him more than a decade of misplaced guilt. It had cost him the relationship he'd built to replace our marriage in the first place. I'd heard secondhand through a mutual friend that Emily had already moved out of state with the twins, unwilling to remain in a place that only reminded her of a foundation that had never been what she believed. Charles hadn't fought to stop her. Some part of me understood why. Some things, once they crack all the way through, aren't worth the effort of pretending they can be repaired. When Charles saw me across the table, he tried one last time. "Nicole," he said quietly before the formal proceedings began, "I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking anyway. Is there any version of this where we try again?" I looked at him for a long moment, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel by that point. Not anger, not even sadness, but a kind of quiet finality, the way you feel when you finish reading the last page of a book you already know the ending to. "There isn't," I said. "Not because I can't forgive you, Charles. I think in time I probably will. But forgiveness was never going to be the same thing as staying." He didn't argue. He simply nodded, and something in his shoulders relaxed, like a part of him had been waiting to hear exactly that, even as another part of him had hoped for something different. The proceedings themselves moved quickly after that. Daniel had done his work well, and there was very little left to contest. When it was finally over, when the last signature had been placed and the last document filed, I stood outside the courthouse in the late morning light and felt for the first time in 8 years entirely unaccountable to anyone else's version of my life. Margaret called me that evening. She didn't ask for forgiveness outright. I think she understood better than most that forgiveness isn't something you can request and receive on the same day. She simply told me she was proud of how I'd handled everything, and that she hoped someday we might still find a way to know each other, even without Charles standing between us. I told her I'd like that. I meant it. Margaret's silence had cost all of us dearly, but I'd watched her spend the last month trying in whatever way she could to make it right. That mattered to me more than she probably realized. I didn't see Charles again after that day, not really a brief business-like exchange months later over a piece of paperwork. Neither of us wanted to deal with nothing more. I heard eventually that he'd sold his share of the logistics company and moved to another city, trying, I assumed, to build a life far enough away from the one that had fallen apart so completely in front of everyone he loved. As for me, I didn't rebuild my life around what I'd lost. I built it around what I'd learned. A year after the divorce was finalized, I used part of the settlement to start a small foundation, one that helps couples navigate infertility treatment with real transparency, full access to their own medical information and support, that doesn't leave anyone carrying blame that was never theirs to carry in the first place. I named it after no one in particular. It didn't need my story attached to it to matter. It just needed to exist. I think about those 8 years, often not with bitterness, but with a strange kind of gratitude for the woman they eventually made me. I spent so long believing I had failed at the one thing I wanted most. I know now that I never failed at anything. I simply trusted people who weren't honest enough to deserve it. For 8 years, I blamed myself. I won't waste another day doing that. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't making someone suffer. It's refusing to carry their lies any longer. If you've made it this far with me, I want to know what you think happens to Nicole next. Do you think she ever lets someone new into her life, or do you think she's found everything she needs on her own? Leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I love hearing from all of you. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you, so make sure you subscribe so you never miss a moment like this. Let's keep this journey going together.